How's it going, everyone? It's Tennyson Danye with NJ.com, NJ Advanced Media. Thank you for joining us for our forum, a continuation of our project, How We Can Make Black Lives Matter When It Comes to Policing. We have several guests, several commenters who have given their thoughts in that project, if you've taken a chance to look at it. And some of them will be with us today to discuss further where they think we're headed in terms of addressing police brutality in New Jersey and really around the United States. But first, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, New Jersey Attorney General Gerber, Greywall, and he has some remarks that he wants to say.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the Star-Ledger for the invitation to join you for this symposium to highlight my Excellence in Policing initiative. And thank you also to the Star-Ledger for having this important conversation about policing reform, about how to shift from protest to policy, and importantly, how to make Black Lives Matter. Let me first acknowledge something that's critical to this discussion. I'll never have the experience of what it's like to be Black in America. Yes, I've experienced discrimination, but I have not shared the experience that a Black man growing up in this country has. But even though I haven't shared that experience, what I can do is listen. Because now more than ever, we need to be speaking to each other, and equally important, listening to each other. I realize that there are systemic and implicit biases that continue to plague our country, and they've plagued us for centuries. From slavery to Reconstruction to Jim Crow to redlining to the war on drugs and mass incarceration to Eric Garner to George Floyd. We can do better. There's no doubt that we're facing difficult times. Our lives have been uniquely altered. They've been altered by the COVID-19 pandemic. At the same time, we're also faced with civil unrest, sparked by the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. But here's the thing, as shocking as Mr. Floyd's death was, we must recognize that it is not unique. So many others have had their lives inexcusably taken, and countless others have faced harassment and other forms of repression. These experiences, along with the millions of peaceful protesters and the overwhelming majority of the public, are all calling for us to take deep, far-reaching action, to finally put an end to our history of violence against minorities, and Black Americans in particular. And that's the reason I'm here. I'm here because I share that commitment to change. I'm here because my office shares that commitment as well. So let me briefly share with you some of what we're doing here in New Jersey to make that change a reality. Our hard work started well before recent events. Over the past 2 years, Governor Murphy and I have worked hard to make New Jersey a national leader on policing practices. We have recognized since day one that law enforcement officers cannot do their jobs without the trust of the people they serve. They need the public's trust, and they need the legitimacy that comes along with it to do their jobs, to ensure public safety. Think about it. If you don't trust your police, you're not going to reach out to them. You're not going to share information with them. You're not going to file complaints or show up to court to testify. Everything hinges on that trust and on that legitimacy, which is derived from the public. From my perspective, as our state's chief law enforcement officer, to build and maintain that trust, we must institute policies and programs that promote transparency, that promote accountability, and that promote professionalism. We need to do that across law enforcement. And that's exactly what we've done since 2018. We have implemented some of the most ambitious and progressive policing reforms in the country. We expanded on those efforts this past December when we launched our Excellence in Policing initiative, which we have continued to build on throughout this year. Some of these programs are well underway, and I'll share a few of them with you. We mandated implicit bias training for all prosecutors, state and county detectives, and state troopers. We created a first-of-its-kind statewide conviction review unit. We launched a first-in-the-nation officer resiliency program to make officer wellness and mental health a priority. We banned chokeholds, except in the most limited of circumstances. We hold regular community listening sessions in all 21 of our counties. We implemented the independent prosecutor bill that the legislature passed and the governor signed last year to ensure that officer use of force investigations are run out thoroughly and without bias. Through the Criminal Sentencing Disposition Commission that the governor reconvened, we've pushed for historic changes to our state's mandatory minimum sentencing laws that have had a disparate impact on Black and brown communities for too long. And many more projects are in progress. We're overhauling the state's police hiring and training programs. We're building a statewide use of force database to ensure accountability and transparency. And at the same time, we're rewriting New Jersey's use of force policies for the first time in 2 decades. We're launching a pilot crisis intervention team training program to respond to individuals in psychiatric crisis. But at the same time, we're also investing tens of millions of dollars in community-based and hospital-based violence interruption programs in cities across New Jersey to finally break both cycles of violence and incarceration. And we're leading the fight to bring transparency to officer disciplinary records, because you have a right to know how we are doing. Because as Sir Robert Peel, the father of modern policing, said it best, the police are the public and the public are the police. Listen, I'm proud of the steps we've taken, and I encourage everyone to visit our website, NJ.gov/OAG/excellence, to read about these programs and all of the other projects we're currently working on. All of these reforms were developed collaboratively. We've worked with everyone from civil rights organizations, religious groups, law enforcement leaders, and community members to ensure that our systemic reforms have systemic-wide buy-in. We've also invited the public to be a part of the process and to give us input on our use of force policy revisions in particular. So if you have thoughts, please submit them to us through our comment portal located on our website, nj.gov/OAG/force. Comments will be accepted through tomorrow, August 21st, 2020. But here's the thing. Now we're faced with a once-in-a-lifetime reckoning, not just about law enforcement, but to all the institutions that are plagued by systemic biases. This is the forefront of our national conversation right now. In order to move forward, much more is needed. More is needed to overcome the impediments to progress. More is needed to heal years and centuries of mistrust between police and the community. More is needed to bridge divides between police and community. And more is needed to truly effectuate lasting change, to reimagine fully how we operate. And that's where all of you come in. With your assistance, we can do more to foster connections. We can do more to form relationships and build understanding and that trust. So I want to thank you for having this conversation. I want to thank you for inviting me to participate, and I want to thank you for helping us move this state forward.
All right, so you heard from the Attorney General. Now I'd like to introduce the first panel for what we were going to call part 1 of this discussion, consensus, change that we can agree on now.
Good afternoon.
First, I would like to introduce the panelists. First, Chairwoman and Senate Law and Public Safety Committee, Senator Greenstein. Quavella Spruill, Public Safety Director, Franklin Township in Somerset County. Zelly Thomas, an activist and educator, as well as Professor Jessica Henry, author, legal commentator, social justice advocate, and associate professor at Montclair State University. Thank you all for joining us. So first question I would like to ask, and I also want to lay down a few ground rules. I'm going to give everyone about 90 seconds to explain their viewpoint, just so everyone gets a chance and that folks aren't cutting each other off. But who would like to take a stab at talking about where we go from now? The Attorney General spoke about what he thought we could be doing and where we can go from there. I'd like to actually ask Senator Greenstein, because you've done some of this work with your committee. I think you are muted. Sorry to cut you off there, but I think your mic is muted.
Got it.
There we
Okay.
go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Tennyson, for introducing me. Thank you to everyone on the panel willing to engage in this much needed conversation. I have a much longer speech than 90 seconds, so I'm going to do my best here. But I want to thank community members who took to the streets from Newark to Camden as part of this movement, because the marches, protests, and interactions were peaceful and powerful. And I can assure you that people in the legislature, many or most people in the legislature, heard your voices. In mid-July, I led the first of what I hope to be one of many hearings on law enforcement reform in our state. We heard from a wide variety of representatives from police unions, the Attorney General, and community leaders, some of whom are on this panel, who gave in-depth and valuable input on changes that we need. We heard from the Attorney General, as you just did, about his visions for transparency and accountability. We heard from fellow panelist Zelly Thomas from the Black Lives Matter movement on what disenfranchised, under-resourced communities experience when interacting with the police. He effectively expressed their fears and concerns and explained why many of our communities are asking for more resources, not just more police. We heard from Giles Shipp, who talked about the need to assure that police forces work with communities they serve, and that building trust is an important objective. Reverend Boyer touched upon the need for empowering our communities to be more involved in their policing while addressing use of force issues, and he spoke of violence as a public health crisis. Mayor Baraka touched upon his many innovative approaches and investment in social workers and peripheral community support to ease the burden of police and offering a greater tool set to respond to individuals in crisis. Bills are coming out of my committee. We have the second group coming out tomorrow. But to sum it up, we have bills that deal with recruitment, which was a major issue that the committee discussed. We have bills about implicit bias and other training issues, which was another major issue that they discussed. One bill that dealt with collecting record and reporting certain prosecutorial and criminal justice data. Lots of bills on cultural diversity that I mentioned. So we have a large group here. We're looking at everything from updating the use of deadly force statutes. We're going to probably be discussing the qualified immunity bill. I don't know if there's a bill on that, but actually the issue. There's really no issue I won't have my community discuss. We may all take different opinions on it, but the important thing is that I think the issues all need to be aired and discussed. And so I am willing to, pretty much post anything that comes to us on these varied issues. We're going to be looking at many of the issues the Attorney General talked about, like police licensing. That one is of major interest to me, and I'm almost done with a bill that I'm doing on that. Community policing, release of police disciplinary records, updating use of force, including chokeholds, civil service standards for recruitment. We're also going to have a session, one or more sessions, where we're going to hear from academics from around the country who will talk to us about the research they're doing and new ideas on police reform. So much to be done. I just gave you nothing but a little overview, but certainly happy to answer any questions on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to go to Jessica. I would like to talk to you because you've dealt with these issues and as a social justice advocate, and you've written about these things, and you are a professor, you teach about these things. What are your thoughts on what you just heard, some of the proposals that have come out over the last few weeks and months?
Hi, so thanks for having me. In the interest of time, I'll just focus on two ideas. I had a bunch, but we'll just focus on two. The first I'd like to talk about is changing the police culture. One of the things that we see, I have lots of students who want to go into law enforcement. When they go into the academy, they're often taught that their loyalty has to be to each other, and that there's this commitment to maintaining the ranks. And what we need to do is shift that conversation so that the loyalty really starts focusing on the communities that they serve. and that they start to understand that being a good officer often involves calling out bad conduct by other officers. There's a program that has been piloted in a number of cities called EPIC. It's called Ethical Policing is Courageous. They piloted it in New Orleans. We see it down in Baltimore. And it seems to really be impacting the use of force by officers because other officers are there to call them out. And that change at the training level needs to be embraced at the top so that we've got supervisors saying to officers who actually step forward, hey, good job, not we're going to reassign you, you're going to be reprimanded. So that's a real shift in culture that I think can happen. There's programs out there that are doing it, and I think it could really be impactful in New Jersey. The second policy reform that I just want to mention also goes to transparency and accountability, which the Attorney General was talking about and also which Senator Greenstein was talking about. Right now, there is a bill in the Senate 2656 that would make police disciplinary records available through the New Jersey Open Records Act. I think that's a great move forward. We need to allow the public access into who's doing the policing and how they're doing. And that would be a really positive and strong step forward, kind of the equivalent of what New York did with 50A. We can do that here in New Jersey. And those are just two policy measures that I would, sort of bring up now. I have lots more on the table, but I'd rather give everyone else an opportunity to speak a little bit first about this. Happy to take questions afterwards.
All right, thank you so much. I want to turn my attention to you, Zelly, now, because as Senator Greenstein mentioned, a lot of folks have been out marching in the streets and making their voices heard, and I know you've been one of those people. And you may have some different ideas about where we can go now, and what have the people that you've been marching with, that you've been organizing with, what are some of the things that they believe that we can actually do right now that may seem to some to be a little bit far-fetched in the moment?
Yeah, I think one of the ideas that we continually talk about within the Black Lives Matter movement is the idea of defunding the police. And what does that actually mean? What does that actually look like for various communities? One of the things I often talk about is the safest communities don't necessarily have the most police officers, right? The safest communities usually have more resources. They have access to better homes, access to better schools, access to better housing and better foods and better healthcare and things of that nature. So what happens when we see over-policing of Black and brown communities is not only leads to police violence, but also mass incarceration and also a lack of resources to an already starving neighborhood. So what happens if we stop investing continuously into the police departments who usually have like bloated budgets? Like, for example, Patterson's police department budget is 26% of the city's budget. What happens if we start shifting some of that money into towards recreation, shifting some of that money into anti-violence work that's proven to reduce gun violence? So in actuality, we'll be able to solve major problems in our communities, which is gun violence, intra-community gun violence, and also police violence. So these ideas of saying, let's stop funding the police, whether it's funding for community policing, funding for more training, millions of dollars towards those initiatives, and funding towards recreation, funding towards anti-violence initiatives, and things that actually will keep us safe.
All right, thank you. I'd like to now turn my attention to Quavella, and you actually have the distinct honor of being the first African-American woman to lead the police department, your current police department in Somerset County, but you were also the first African-American woman to hold the position of Chief of Detectives in Essex County at the prosecutor's office. So I think you have a unique stance on this, in that you can kind of see it from different angles, and especially with the work that you're doing now. What goes through your mind when you hear this discussion? Because it's not a new discussion, but it's one that we seem to continue to have.
So, and I must say, I think everyone has touched on my perspective in terms of law enforcement and dealing with the community. And I'll say, Zelly, especially the socioeconomic part of it. I think crime, police don't bring those issues. Those issues usually exist. If people do not have proper housing, healthcare, jobs, money to feed their families, they have a breaking point. And I was always taught that. I grew up in the city of Newark, that everyone We would arrest people and we would ask, like, why were you out committing robberies, burglaries? And 9 times out of 10, it was for other issues, either drug addiction, or some people said straight to feed their families, because they weren't working for X number of months and they no longer had unemployment and they felt desperate. So I think if those problems are taken care of, it will reduce crime. Let's face it, you will always have people that do things that do not follow the laws. It's a human characteristics. Rules are meant to be broken. If we could just write things in black and white and people would abide by them, there'll be no need for the police, or the court system, or we could just have legislators to create great rules and people would follow them and we would live in harmony. But that's not how we are. But the other part of it is that I've seen, we are sometimes looking for the wrong type of individuals to be police. There was a movement where the war on drugs. So everyone was a militant, everyone was the military. And it's funny that, like, right now we're going through the hiring process and, my eyes are wide open in terms of talking to candidates and listening to what they say and the things that they want to focus on. I want professionals. I want people who want to go out and serve the public. Everyone's quoting Robert Peel, but Robert Peel also said, yeah, we are police, but we are also citizens. So when I step out of these doors, I am a citizen and I want to be treated a certain way. And not because I'm the director, not because I was a chief. Most people don't even know that about me when I go out in the streets, only like in our communities. Sometimes, I'm overlooked. I'm just in Stop and Shop. But I want to be treated like a citizen. I want my son, my daughter, my family members to be treated properly as well. So I'm looking at all of that, the way we train, the way we recruit, the things that are taught in the academy. I think, Jessica, you are spot on. There are some, team, the wolf pack, that type of mentality that we have to break up. So I think it's great that we're having the movement right now. I hope this finally gets us over that hurdle and everyone is uncomfortable enough to do something. I can remember, when gyms were open, the trainer was saying to me, if you keep doing, moseying along on a treadmill, going at your 2-mile-per-hour pace, you're never going to see change. So right now, I think the movement, what happened with George Floyd is making everyone a little bit uncomfortable. And that's what we need to have a change.
Thank you. And I want to say to everyone that's watching on Facebook, if you have questions for our panel, that you can submit them in the comments and I will try to get to them. Now I want to turn my attention back to Senator Greenstein and kind of going off of those remarks and how change is incremental, but there comes times where we have to push the envelope a little bit more. Just in your work with the committee and writing law in New Jersey, what are some of the challenges to making this happen as quickly as people may want them to, legally?
Yeah. Well, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay. Not every legislator necessarily feels the same way about it. So everybody has different senses of priorities and whatever. So that's part of it. You have to really mobilize the support. That takes time. Leadership has to be supportive. And I do think in the Senate, we have supportive leadership. And even in the Assembly, I think they do want to do some of this now. They realize that things have changed. And I just think you need a couple of people in there, and I think we do have a couple, who really want to see us do some perhaps brave things, maybe more than we've usually done. Because when you do these, there are political ramifications in certain areas where people in certain districts would say, well, that's not as much of a priority. Why is it something you're working on? But I feel that we've moved into a different time, indirectly because of George Floyd, but probably, I'm sure, because of everything that's been built up over a long period of time. And I feel like this is an opportunity to really look at some of these issues and make changes. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to do that.
Zelly, as an activist with Black Lives Matter, what is that conversation like? The conversation of, we want systemic change and we want it now. but knowing that there are these types of hurdles, legal hurdles, like how do you have that conversation with the folks that you're marching with, the folks that are mobilizing for this cause, in a way that that recognizes the real challenges that may slow it down?
No, it's a really difficult conversation. It's a real difficult thought for you to have. If you can imagine some of the people that's the young leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement right now, they may be in their 20s, young teens, and you really think about it, like at the start with maybe Mike Brown in 2014 or Trayvon Martin in 2012, some of these incidents happened when a lot of the leaders now were in middle school, grammar school, high school. So they've been, in a sense, been watching injustices towards Black people for like most of their lives. And most of their lives, they've been told, to wait, change is going to come, it's going to take time. But now we're at this point where people are being tired of hearing it's going to take time and just wait, and they want to see some action now. I think the other big piece of it is that we hear a lot of people talking about systemic racism, which is a beautiful thing that we actually are able to use those terms and name these things. But unfortunately, even though we keep talking about systemic racism, we continually start having these legislations or talking points pretty much emphasizing that racism is an individual thing. So we keep talking about, police trainings and things of that nature. But what happens if one officer does, for example, even if they're all trained, he still harms somebody? How is that person going to be held accountable? We need to also be talking about laws or systems like civilian complaint review boards or ending qualified immunity that will really allow officers who do, if they were trained, to still be held accountable.
Thank you. Jessica, in your experience as an educator and someone who has studied these topics and has studied social justice initiatives that have happened before, what's the role of really folks educating themselves on some of these systemic functions that may seem like they are so part of our subconscious, things that we aren't thinking about, right? That especially when it comes to this topic of police brutality and the notion that maybe, well, in my town it's safe and we do things this way. The role of education in terms of learning about folks who don't live and look like you. Can you speak a little bit about how that is important in this conversation as well?
All of it's critically important. The more that we can increase our own awareness of the stuff we're bringing to the table, the better off we're going to be as a society at the whole. But in terms of policing specifically, I'm often struck by the interplay between policing and the policymakers. So the policymakers set out that we are having a war on drugs today, or we're going to go on a war on gangs today, or we're going to, and the rhetoric that's used sort of sends officers then into poor communities, particularly communities of color, and you see over policing, often for even minor things, right? We're going to go after the broken windows. And then you bring people into the system, you stigmatize them with misdemeanor criminal convictions, often for crimes they didn't commit, but they just don't have the resources to fight. And you're creating this perpetuation of the myth of the criminal and the dangerous folks. And it sets up, again, going to what Covella was saying, this us versus them mentality. And we need to just shed that. We need to really start thinking about what are the biases we're bringing in when we set up policies like broken windows policing or war on whatever, because it's often imbued with these structural racist policies. And they are manifest in communities that are, to Zelly's point, often under-resourced and underserved in the first place.
Thank you. Covella, I'm going to ask you to kind of wrap this up in a bow, this portion of the panel for us. And again, in your experience, the things that you've heard today and the things you've heard over the last few weeks, if you could just name 2 or 3 things that you think could work today, or, that we can really actually change in police departments around New Jersey.
I think, first of all, diversity. Our communities do not reflect the makeup of the police departments. So, and why is that important? Because, when I was working my way through the ranks, we would always be a shortage of female police officers. So every single case where there was a female and they needed a female to talk to another female or to relate to another female, whether it be a witness or a suspect or whatever was going on, they called for me. And I mean, it can get exhausting. It gave me a wide range of experience, but that goes for diversity as well, because the way I see things may be different from what a white male sees. When you're talking to someone who comes in and you're interviewing them and they have a 5-year gap on their resume, people question that, like, well, what were you doing between, high school and this and when you got your first job doing this? Well, I was working at Home Depot, Walmart, wherever I could to make ends meet, or I was on unemployment, and that is held against people even in this profession. So the diversity in terms of selection needs to be beefed up. We need to make sure that we are representing our communities. We need to make sure that there are female, male, different races and ethnicities in every police department, not just say in urban areas, because every single community within New Jersey has a various makeup of different individuals. That is our key. New Jersey stronger together, I think they said one time, but it's because everyone lives here. And again, community policing, it's not just about a unit, it's not programs. Every single one of my officers, I want them to manifest that practice of community policing because they work for the community. Customer service. We have to make sure that training is consistent in every single police department. Wavella Spruill's police department should not be any better than any other police department throughout this state. They should all operate pretty much the same, expecting the same from officers from the time they're hired to the time they're working, the standards they have in terms of termination, whatever the rules are here, or whatever, they should be everywhere. So if I will fire someone for having X number of use of force complaints that are sustained, the next police department should be required to do the same thing. So I think consistency, accountability, transparency, and education of our community and our police are key to making this work.
All right, thank you, and thank you really to everyone for joining us for this portion of the panel. We do want to move on so that we have enough time for our next few guests, but I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to speak to us. Thanks. All right. So we're going to move on to the next portion of our panel, our discussion, and this is going to center more on the future of policing and some of the bigger ideas that have come out of this movement, in terms of ideas that maybe everyone isn't on board with right now, or may never be on board with, but things that our panelists believe we should also be talking about. So first, I'd like to introduce Giles Shipp. He is the commissioner, the New Jersey Police Training Commission, former president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, or NOBLE, and he's the current president of the New Jersey chapter of NOBLE. We have Ryan Haygood, who is a civil rights lawyer, and he's also the CEO of New Jersey's Institute for Social Justice. And last, we have John Farmer Jr., the director of the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University and the former New Jersey Attorney General. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I want to start with Giles. I'd love to start with some of the thoughts that you expressed in the project, and just get some of your thoughts on, all right, we're having these conversations now, but where are these conversations eventually going to take us? Or where do you believe that it should be headed?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And thank you for taking on this topic. It's a very important topic, and it's not easy. It's not an easy one to discuss because change is inevitable, and we're going to have change. It depends on how you manage that change anywhere in life. One of the things that I wanted to start out by saying is that, as the Attorney General has alluded to, this is not just a New Jersey issue. This is not just a United States issue. This is, as a result of what happened with the George Floyd incident, this has become a global issue. And specifically, though, it's focused on the United States and how policing is done, how policing is carried out, and how it fits into our criminal justice process. We need to start at the beginning. I know there's a lot of legislation now that's moving forward. There are a lot of policy changes being discussed, but we have to look at it. We can't tinker around the edges. And it's not an easy job. You know, it's like trying to fix a plane while it's flying. It's going to be difficult, but it's something that we have to do, and we have to start at the beginning. One of the things we need to look at is our police training in the state of New Jersey. We still have training that has been on the books for over 20 years with respect to specifically the use of force, and we haven't looked at that. Is that relevant for today's policing? That's some of the things we need to look at. And I just picked that one topic, but we need to take a deep dive into all of our police training and look at that training and see if it's one relevant to today, see if there's been any improvements that we can make. And another thing that we have to do is we need to develop a matrix so that we can monitor if in fact that is working or if that is not working. And if it's not working, we need to make the necessary adjustments. We can never forget that we police at the consent of the people. And so if we're not policing at the consent of the people, whether it's real or perceived, we need to look at that. We need to examine that, analyze that, and make the necessary changes. Because without the trust of the community and without being looked at as a legitimate entity, we cannot do our work as law enforcement leaders in an effective and in a comprehensive way. We just can't, because three things that we have to do. We have to make sure that the community is partnering with us on these police issues. If they're not, guess what? They're not going to come to us with their information. We can't put a police officer on every street. We have to have that partnership, not only because of the moral reasons, but also for us to do our jobs in an efficient and effective way. If we're not partnering with the community and they don't look at us as a legitimate entity, they're not going to testify for us at various different criminal prosecutions. And also, finally, we also have to have and maintain the community's trust, because these are the same members that serve on juries. And if we want to, and I believe we all want to, turn back just verdicts, if they don't believe or trust us, then I think that's going to be skewed. So we must maintain that the community's trust. And we have to look at the way that we're policing, going all the way back to the hiring process and who we're selecting to be law enforcement officers. And I can tell you, after my 35 years, two character traits that we need to pay close attention to is, one is people that have empathy for others. All right, we're in the service industry. We protect too, but we're also in the service industry. And also too, we need to look at people that have interpersonal skills. One of the issues that I always harp on, because one person gets a 94 on a written examination, another person gets a 90, that doesn't necessarily mean that person with the 94 is going to be a better police officer. So we have to look at, how people interact with other people and what are they bringing to the table with respect to their life experiences.
Thank you. John, I saw you kind of nodding your head there. And your experience as a former attorney general, I'm sure you're used to hearing from the public and kind of taking the public's thoughts into consideration when it comes to law enforcement. When you hear terms like defund the police, abolish the police, in this moment in time, do you think that's the right word? Is that the way we should be heading?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you for having me on this panel. I really appreciate the opportunity. My experience with police reform as Attorney General was really transformative for me. And in the years since, I have continued those efforts in other places. I've worked with the Department of Justice, building communities of trust program. I went all over the country facilitating roundtables between police and community. And while at Rutgers, we've actually done police reform work in Europe as well as in the United States. I agree with a lot of the critiques that you've heard. And actually, there have been, it depends on how you define defund, obviously. I take it that most people, when they talk about defunding the police, they're really talking about reprioritizing resources. And there have been programs that have done that. Early in my career, as a federal prosecutor, we had a pilot program in Trenton called Weed and Seed, and the idea was that we would prosecute the worst offenders federally, but that was accompanied by, or supposed to be accompanied by, massive infusion of resources for social programs, education, health, and other needed benefits to the population. And as long as that was happening, the program worked very well. What fell victim to, and a lot of these things do fall victim, is it's hard to sustain. The key to all this is sustaining the effort. And after a couple of years, the federal money for all these social programs disappeared, and then the program didn't work anymore because it was lacking that essential funding. I mean, I think there are really two issues that really need one, immediate addressing, and then long term for New Jersey. First is I agree with Giles in terms of training. One of the things that we've done overseas and also in the U.S. that I think is really fills an important void is actually doing joint training with police and community. So in other words, you have the community involved in the training of the police so that each understands when there's an encounter what to expect from the other. And that plays a major role in sort of lowering the fear factor. A lot of these incidents occur, I think, because everybody's scared to death of everybody else. There have been a 30% increase in shootings of police this year, and an increase in violence against community members as well. And so you can imagine from each side, you go into these encounters and you're scared to death. I don't see any way to bridge that other than a lot more direct involvement, joint training with police and communities as often as possible. And then longer term, and I'll just throw this on the table as an attempt to sort of outflank Ryan Haygood before he gets a chance to talk, if that's possible. But if you look at the things that are systemically wrong and embedded in New Jersey, and I'll borrow a term here from chaos theory, sensitive dependence on initial conditions. The initial conditions we have in New Jersey, so many of the things that are wrong that have to do with the segregation de facto that exists in the state, the underfunding of important social programs and health resources and everything else, the allocation of law enforcement resources, it's all tied to the same ill, and we all know what it is. It's an over-reliance on home rule and on local taxation. And it's something that has been raised to the court years ago in a case called Robinson versus Cahill, where they asked the court to decide on equal protection grounds, state constitutional grounds, that the home rule reliance on local property taxes was unjust. And as a result, the education system was underfunded. And the court declined to rule that broadly because, frankly, they were afraid of the implications of that because it would be revolutionary. And instead, they went off on the thorough and efficient clause in the state constitution to fund education. I think, having been an observer and a participant in this for so many years, that in order to really get at the systemic problems, the systemic racism and the systemic inequities that exist in New Jersey, the governor and legislature should form a task force to look at alternatives to the reliance on local taxation to fund the majority of law enforcement, education, health, and everything else, because the result has been demonstrable inequity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. This is your life's work. You've lobbied for issues of criminal justice, restorative justice. You lobbied for the restoration of voting rights for folks on probation and parole, and really have talked about the idea of opening up to that idea for folks who have served their time. You've also spoken publicly about the youth justice system and how a lot of people's first introduction to the justice system, to the law, is their experience with the youth justice system. And here in New Jersey, and I'm sure you can throw out the facts better than I can, but the proportion of Black and brown youth who are reprimanded in the system compared to their white counterparts who may be committing crimes at the same rates, if not more, are staggering. So what are your thoughts on all of that and where we are in the future of policing?
So Tennyson, thanks for your leadership in putting this conversation together along with your team, Enrique and Robin. Really thought the piece that the written piece was really powerful, and just thankful to be a part of this conversation here. I was really struck by sort of your early framing, Tennyson, you and Attorney General Greywall talked about how this particular conversation is centuries old, right? So I was thinking about that. I have been really struck by the June edition of the New Yorker magazine. This is the cover, and you'll see, obviously, this is a powerful image of George Floyd's outline. And then in it are folks who have been a part of Black history in this country. In the middle of it here is a gentleman who's on the ground surrounded by 4, turned out to be white police officers. He's Rodney King. This is March 3rd, 1991. I'm 45. I was in high school at that time. This is sort of my George Floyd, my awakening in high school. Next to Rodney King is Emmett Till. Congressman John Lewis, the late Congressman John Lewis, talked about how Emmett Till was his George Floyd. And I lift that up because we have been having conversations like these really since this country was founded, around the kind of harm done to Black people and how hard it is to realize the idea that Black lives matter when we're constantly talking about harm reduction strategies. So this is not a new conversation, but I'm thankful for your leadership, Tennyson, and bringing us to it. And I want to lift up this point that Jessica made. She talked a bit about how one of the major challenges around policing is around culture. So there was a commentator who talked about how, we're not having a conversation about a few bad apples. She said, instead, we're talking about a police culture that, in her words, is an orchard of poison trees. And these poison trees are diseased at the root. And so they then produce poison, sometimes even deadly fruit. So the conversation is really about the culture of policing and how it's rooted in structural racism. And we're seeing the cracks in our foundation caused by structural racism, causing real earthquakes in Black and brown and other communities of color in this moment that folks are thinking of as sort of a pandemic in a pandemic, right, in a pandemic. And so I think there's 2 things to the culture point. The first is you got to find ways to stop the harm. And this is kind of on the policy side. So it's good to see Senator Greenstein talk about some of her work. I think we're in a moment where we have to push very, very hard. One of the dangers here is that symbolism takes the place of real policy reform. And you're seeing this. It's important symbolism, but you're seeing, for example, Black Lives Matter being painted on streets here in Newark. Christopher Columbus was removed from one of our parks. You're seeing even in Mississippi, things folks didn't think would happen, the Confederate flag removed from the state flag. Those are important movements in removing symbols, but those symbols reflect underlying systems of structural racism, and we got to get to those. So, I have a dear friend who will soon lead the Innocence Project, Christina Swarns, who said that the big problem with policing is that it has been for too long an accountability-free profession, that you could do very foul things, including kill people, and not face any accountability, no repercussions. So policies have to be passed, very aggressive ones, banning chokeholds in New Jersey, for example, not creating an exception for their use, but banning them outright, ending qualified immunity outright to get at bad actors, right? Changing the use of force standard to protect those who have been on the other side of law enforcement abuse, requiring law enforcement officials to live in the communities they serve. If you work in Newark as a police officer, you should live in the city of Newark as a police officer. There are real advantages to having people who work in a community, live in a community, serve that community. And then obviously a meaningful citizen complaint review board. The New Jersey Supreme Court struck Newark's yesterday. The legislature can act to do this. The number of policies are recommended and more. It's got to be an aggressive move to build accountability into a system here, policing, that has for too long been without it. But then on the investment side, this is to Zelly's point and to General Farmer's point here. Look, the reality is New Jersey has the highest Black to white youth and adult incarceration disparity rate in the country for a reason. So a Black child in New Jersey is 21 times more likely to be in prison than a white child. A Black adult is 12 times more likely to be in prison than a white adult. These are the highest racial disparities in the country. And here's the thing, the research shows that Black and white people commit most offenses at about the same rate. So the racial disparities don't reflect actual participation in crime. No, what they reflect is that we make very deep financial and other investments in law enforcement strategies that, one, don't actually keep us safe and actually are harmful. So in New Jersey right now, under Governor Murphy's budget, we invest $300,000 to incarcerate each young person. I mean, think about that. $300,000 to incarcerate each young person. And to be clear, in the whole state of New Jersey, more than 9 million people, there are eight white kids in prison, 8. Now, we're not suggesting that New Jersey should incarcerate more white kids, but it is clear that low number reflects a very different response from the criminal justice system directed at white kids when white kids do what kids tend to do, right? But we invest $300,000. That's a specific investment to incarcerate Black and brown kids. And so part of the strategy, as Mayor Ras Baraka has begun to do, to General Farmer's point, we got to begin to make investments in systems that empower communities. Right now, kids in New Jersey across the state are required to learn online at home. Though we know several 100,000 kids can't log on to the internet, and if they have a device, they can't do it. And if they don't have a device, they definitely can't do it. So we know several 100,000 kids in New Jersey are without the tools to learn online at home, though there's a mandate for them to do so. But we have invested deeply in incarcerating kids. We're in a place where New Jersey has borrowed $10 billion, right, to address a budget shortfall. Every line item in the budget has been impacted, with the exception of the criminal justice and law enforcement line item. That has been untouched. And so until we begin to make investments and strategies that actually empower communities, that actually make Black lives matter, we won't advance materially on this conversation, because the Bible says where your heart is, there your treasure is also. Like, our heart has to be in investing in strategies, building systems, filling in cracks that make Black lives matter, really.
Thanks, Ryan. We have about 5 more minutes, so I have a couple more questions I want to get to. We have a question from Facebook, from Mary from Facebook, who asked, when hearing about the Attorney General's proposals, his initiatives, and really, I'm going to take it a step further, some of the things we've heard on this virtual forum, how do we get that to trickle down on the town and the township level, especially in places that may not have cash to just, make decisions that freely, and they're strapped for cash?
Well, one of the ways we have to do it, and I have 8 years of working in the Attorney General's office, and fortunately working for 6 Attorney Generals, so I have a very varied view on that issue. And where in as much as the former Attorney General Farm alluded to, we have home rule in New Jersey, and that makes a lot of those things very difficult. But we need to look at it even at a county basis or at a state basis. For example, most of us agree that body-worn cameras are an important tool for law enforcement now, from the prosecutorial side and even from the police side. And it makes a difference on the interactions between those individuals. In most cases, it makes that interaction safer. So if we agree upon that as a premise, and the municipalities can't afford that money, why don't the state have one main database that houses that? And I know a little bit about that because I've done a lot of research in that area and served on Attorney General Hoffman's body-worn camera first initiative team. And that would cut costs tremendously. So what we have to do, we have to provide public safety. All right, that's embedded in our Constitution. So being that is the case, if we know that something is going to wind up saving us money in the long run, because those investigations, what we tend not to look at is we look at the upfront costs. We tend not to look at how much is it going to cost us to not have it. Can we afford not to do it? Because a lot of these towns are getting saddled with these various different lawsuits, and those monies could be utilized. So what we have to do, and sum it all up, we have to think outside the box. If we know something works and is going to be a benefit, we have to figure out a way to make it happen.
So my last question, and I want everyone to kind of take a stab at this. Do you all see significant change happening within the next 5 years? And anyone can start.
Well, I guess I would say yes and no. I think the big change that I see now, from the time I was in office and in all the years that I've been working on these issues around the country and also in Europe, is that just the number of people across the country who now see it, okay, who now see the reality of the inequity and the discrimination and how deep-seated it is. I think that's a transformative change that's occurred this summer. The challenge is to translate what's been going on in the streets into actual real policy changes. That's the hard part. Sustaining these things is always difficult because at some point, the energy for the street demonstrations tends to lag. But the trick is to seize upon that energy while it's here, and to get commitments from people, leaders like Senator Greenstein, to take the initiative and to actually try to enact these measures into policy. I think I'm optimistic that significant reforms will happen. I'm less optimistic that will address what I think is the root cause of all of New Jersey's problems, which is that, home rule is a new redlining. It basically it isolates communities from each other, and we are all a victim of that. And its effects are deleterious across the board. It has costs to our state, and it results in severe inequities. And I think it would be great if this was the opportunity to seize that issue. But I think what's going to have to happen is some governor and legislature are going to have to form a task force, look at the way other states are funded for more equitable ways to structure our state. And that's the thinking outside the box that I think Giles was talking about.
I mean,
Ryan, can I get your thoughts?
Sure, I would say, Tennyson, I share General Farmer's optimism. Look, when Dr. King was assassinated, there were protests in hundreds of cities across the country. When George Floyd was killed, there were and have been protests in thousands of cities. And so I do think it's not an exaggeration to be thinking about this moment, as many are, as sort of the beginning of the third Reconstruction. The people are awakened in a way that they haven't previously been, to General Farmer's point. And so I think now comes the challenge of us making Black Lives Matter really. So beyond the symbolism, right? Beyond the way in which symbols will be used to quell the protest, let's use the symbolism to get to the underlying structural racism that these symbols reflect. And let's in particular move so that the Attorney General can do a lot of things through directives. Those may or may not survive his tenure in the seat, which is why the legislative body has to be pushed to make those policies real in the law. So I just want to lift up for folks, we have created a 10 things you can do document. This is styled 10 things you can do to advance racial justice after you say Black Lives Matter. So we agree, although that undeniable truth is being assaulted everywhere in the country, that Black Lives Matter. Here's how you can make that matter really in policies. And to be clear, we are fortunate to have a lot of courageous legislators, but even courageous legislators, if they don't hear from their constituents, I know there's an active discussion happening right now in the chat. When we move that discussion to the legislators, they take notice. Very often, even progressive thinking, feeling legislators are keepers of the status quo, if not pushed to do more. So we ought to be asking for big things. To John Farmer's point, we have accepted in New Jersey that we are blessed with this incredible racial diversity. I think we're second in our racial diversity only to California. But we're at the same time one of the most racially segregated states in the country. And too many of us have accepted that. One of the byproducts of that is that our classrooms are among the most segregated by race and by poverty because of the home rule law that the general identified. Now's the moment, yes, to be tackling police, reimagination, transformation, reinvestment, but we can't just be talking about policing if we're talking about how you empower communities more broadly. We have to be thinking about issues like school segregation, economic inequality, healthcare disparities. Like, how do you make investments in empowering our folks in areas that help us to win, less about how do we stop the harm from coming to us through police brutality. And so I encourage folks, take a look, 10 things you can do to advance racial equality after you say Black Lives Matter.
And where can people find that? Is that on the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice website?
So that's on our website. It's njisj.org. It's in the slider. You can find it there. And look, the truth is, to answer your question concretely, the answer about whether things change, it relies entirely on us. The extent to which we organize urge our legislators to be courageous, and we stand with them to ensure that they're accountable to us now and when they run for re-election. So I think absolutely yes, but we will have to be the ones to make that happen.
Thank you, Ryan.
Sure.
Giles, you've heard what they've said about that question. Do you see significant change happening within 5 years? I'll let you take us home. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, I believe so. After my 35 years in policing, I've never seen policing and communities as polarized as they are today. And we have to change. And if we are going to make those advancements as a society, we have to talk to each other and we have to sit down at the table. And the community has to be a large part of that conversation. We have to really take what the community, it can't be just a listening session. It has to be action put to that after that conversation is discussed. You know, as a lot of folks say, we've been here before. As I said earlier, because of the global push that's around this, it makes me more optimistic, you know, and right now, the world is watching and we're going to be judged based on what we do. So I feel that we can. I know we have a lot of brilliant people in the state, but we have to make sure, as Ryan referred to, we have to make sure that's changed through policy and then codified through legislation.
Thank you. And we've heard a lot of great comments from folks today, not only on this forum, but we've also heard from nearly 50 New Jerseyans from all walks of life about how we can make Black Lives Matter when it comes to policing. For those watching on Facebook, if you haven't had a chance to check out that project on NJ.com, it's How We Make Black Lives Matter. So I'd like to just kind of summarize and tie this up in a bow for us. There are things that people think we can be doing now. There are things that people think that we can do in the future if we have some very critical conversations and use this moment, the anger that people are feeling, to educate themselves on the issues of systemic racism, police brutality, and not only in this moment, but the history of those issues in this country. So for Giles Shipp, for Ryan Haygood, for John Farmer Jr., Senator Linda Greenstein, Quavella Spruill, Zellie Thomas, and Jessica Henry, this was How We Can Make Black Lives Matter when it comes to policing. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.